This is a story of existence, non-existence, and rebirth, of light, dark, and life anew. Feel it warmly, like a melody brushing behind your ear. Sing it again, so that others may not forget. And when you hear it, may it remind you that even in the darkest of depths, that its glow will find you again. But before these words can exist, I promised you a story, and I'll tell it in kind. Nestled somewhere far beyond your star was a bright and jubilant world, one filled with all the joy and laughter of a newborn. In its infancy, this planet flourished and breathed with its carapace inhabitants. They were beautiful, just like all life should be. And even in this simplicity, they knew only how to live and love expeditiously and without regret. Created from the hopes and ambitions of these beings came the Helioptera, a sun beetle by the name of Apollo. Born from igneous and cinder deep below the planet's layers, it was he that tugged the sun across the skies, bringing light and warmth to his people from its inception. As the dawn tender, it was his charge to nurture his planet's most beloved deity, the Helion. It was more than just a responsibility, however. This star was his friend. When its solar tendrils needed trimming, he would do so with great care. When it hungered, he would fetch rocks and space dust aplenty to satiate its cosmic bellows. When it felt sad, he would sing a song with the utmost alacrity to raise its spirits. And when it grew weary from a long day of giving life, it was he that would blanket it from the world and let it rest so it could rise the next morning. This world, although grateful for his care of its most valuable god, did not treat Apollo the way one might treat a champion or a hero. They had no need for such a thing. Instead, he lived among them in the simplest of ways. A burrow beneath the soft soil was all he ever needed, and he was at peace knowing that his existence served a purpose far beyond himself, and that the songs he sang were heard by all and cherished by even more. But what happens when heat sleeps and chill comes to seek? Is it mild? Is it meek? In the night its heart grows weak, and you can only pray hate does not run deep. You felt it coming, I'm sure. The part in all good stories where light turns to dark, and laughter turns to screams. The end of it all is no different, not for anyone. It was on that fateful night after putting the Helion to rest that the story of this world would shift and crack at the seams by a force both intangible and unseen. Is this what they call destiny? At dawn, or what would be dawn, Apollo found the Helion in a frozen stupor. No longer did it sprout stalks of molten energy. No longer did it take its meals of nitrate-rich clumps of stone, or dance to the melodies that once spurred it to exist. He did not know it, but this was the death knell of a star. On the first morning, its absence was met with a great understanding from the beings of this world. Apollo explained that things like this just happened, without knowing full well if that was true. But over the coming days, understanding turned to confusion. Over the coming weeks, it turned to discontent. Over several months, it became hatred. Upon realizing that nothing would change, his brothers and sisters began to flee in fear one by one. The crop tender, the wave tender, the stone tender, and the cloud tender, all champions of this world and fellow servants of the gods, abandoning their planet that they had helped grow, leaving only a dying world and its enraged inhabitants behind. Apollo could only stand and watch as sickness overtook his home, morphing it into darkness and dim-lit shadow, and shifting his kinfolk into beasts that tore everything they had built, stone from stone, root from root, and tendon from tendon. He tried to plead with them, to get them to understand reason. Alas, nothing took. They were frenzied and changed. Cowardice and fear eventually overtook him, and self-preservation forced him to act. He began to dig deeper and deeper, until he reached a recess so dark that no one would ever find him. And there he slept. For how long? I can't say. In this deep slumber, he heard it for the first time. A melody so beautiful it brought tears even to his resting eyes. He saw the deepest corners of space, and trailing along its expanse was a rope of sound that tethered to his mind and pulled until it snapped, pulling him from his hibernation. When the Helioptera did rise from his pit of despair, he found the planet barren and decimated. There was nothing left but ash and carapace, bones of a world that had not been alive in quite some time. Hanging above it all, a dark blot on a charcoal sky, naught but a mal ichor emanating from its bleak shell. Without a thought, Apollo floated upwards, pressing a hand gently to its frigid skin, hoping to find any sort of pulse. He collapsed against the reality of it all, staring blankly into a void that he had once loved but abandoned out of fear. Coward, monster, abomination, murderer. These words floated through his skull as tears flooded his ducts, blinding him from himself and everything around him. He thought to himself that he would simply lie there until he too faded away. He deserved it after all, or something much worse. Between breathy cries, he could hear that melody, the same one he had heard in a dream. But was it a dream? Or was it always there? Apollo wiped the tears from his eyes and turned to meet its source. In the distance, so very far away, he saw the vision of a cool blue planet, one that did not yet exist, but begged to live. Within its waters rested the cells of life and love, not quite unlike the ones that once filled his kin. Its existence was all but guaranteed, like a seed sprouting deep below the soil. He could help it grow, if only he could reach it. The melody called to him, rising in volume and in passion. Notes materialized and ebbed against the shrillness in his mind, quelling his rage and anger at himself, and the sadness tightening its grip against his heart. From behind, Apollo heard the fluttering of fragile wings kissing the corpse of a once great star. As he turned, he saw trickling from its husk small blue beings, souls in the forms of something new and spectacular. These were the ghosts come to haunt him, he thought. Coward, abomination, monster, murderer. These disparate voices in Apollo's mind faded from words of hostility he created to those of forgiveness and those of understanding. He didn't understand it, but a heat began to grow within him, replacing the quiet beating of his heart with an uncontainable explosion of raw energy. Without thinking, he knew what he had to do. He tethered himself to the dead star, and with the help of the souls in tow, began to pull it headlong towards the distant song of birth. Unbeknownst to Apollo, the dead Helion began to hum quietly and sputter. In his fiery state, he could not feel the heat licking at his heels and back. Its core began to glow, and slowly but surely, it ignited and churned as he shot full speed towards his fate, growing in size and radiance as he pushed against the weight of the world. How long this journey took is incalculable, but in his trance, Apollo moved forward, never stopping to rest or care or think of anything. The melody played in his head for what felt like eons, but it never grew old. It was his muse, and space was his canvas as he roared and ripped faster and faster to reach a new purpose, fearing this world too may die a frozen death without ever having the chance to live. When he arrived, it felt as though time had never moved, but he could see it clearly now. Once a foggy vision or a hazy dream, now a pale azure ball of a world teeming with all the ingredients for life, but no catalyst to spark it. Did he fail? Was he too late? He stayed there, suspended for a while, before exhaustion began to take him. Unlatching from the sun he assumed to be dead, he opened his eyes to see it glowing as brightly and hotly as it ever had. With barely enough energy in him to move an inch, Apollo mustered just enough to stretch out a hand to reach for it, an old friend he thought was gone forever. Now grinning with tears in his eyes, he spiraled down towards the planet, tumbling down and down with his vision full of hot orange and yellow, before crashing into a pool of freezing water. He sank like a stone, letting the water fill his mouth, his throat, and his lungs. He did not struggle for air, and he did not fight to live. His job was done, and as he sank to the depths of a lifeless sea, he heard it. Nothing. Not the sounds of a musical song as he had heard for so many eons now. Nothing. With a tinge of sadness, the eerie drone of a noiseless basin sweetly kissed him goodnight, as his eyelids fell like curtains at the end of it all. Is the story over? Is this where it ends? Even now, the never-ending war of life and death marches on in his heart. Maybe you could be a part of the story. Will you sing it for me? Just one last time. When Apollo awoke, it was not in a cold, wet tomb. It was in a soft, warm cot with the most breathtaking woman he had ever seen standing above him, blotting his head with a damp rag and checking his temperature. His eyes met hers, and the melody filled his ears for but a second before he fell into a sleep once more. Not a slumber, just a restful sleep. One that he was free to wake up from whenever he saw fit. Eventually, he would regain his strength, and the woman named Ophelia would bring him outside for some air for the first time. Stepping through the threshold, his vision filled with a verdant sea of grass, wildflowers that danced and brushed against one another, birds that took from long strips of bark and canopies of dark green attached to their heads, and a never-ending canvas of blue with clumps of white lazily drifting through the air. And at the top of it all, perched triumphantly against that canvas, he saw it. An old friend now perfectly at home in this world's sky. One that he had hoped had forgiven him. It was life, for the first time of what felt like forever. It was something worth living for. He balled a fist and looked to the horizon, pondering if all the things he had done, his failures, his inhibitions, and the death of so many that he had once loved, made him deserving of something so perfect. In that moment of uncertainty, not knowing if he was worthy, something soft and blue caught his eye, flapping tiny, delicate wings in his direction. He held out a finger and let it rest there. In that moment, he decided that today, despite it all, he was.